when unemployed aircraft mechanic Elena Vasquez agreed to investigate a World War II fighter plane hidden deep in the Colorado wilderness she'd inherited from her estranged grandmother. She was desperately trying to avoid losing custody of her 10-year-old daughter Sofia to her ex-husband's wealthy family. But beneath the corroded aluminum and decades of mountain snow lay secrets that would expose a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the U.S. military and transform her family's dire circumstances forever. For what Elena discovered sealed within the aircraft's hidden compartments had been missing for over 80 years, and there were powerful forces who would stop at nothing to keep it buried in those remote Rocky Mountain forests. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this journey moves you, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow we have something even more extraordinary waiting for you. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who couldn't quite meet Elena Vasquez's eyes as she signed for the certified letter. Standing in the doorway of her cramped two-bedroom apartment in Aurora, Colorado, Elena felt the familiar weight of desperation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "Mama, who was that man?" Sofia's voice drifted from the kitchen table, where she sat working on her math homework, her dark hair falling across concentrated features that reminded Elena painfully of herself at that age. "Just the mailman, sweetheart," Elena lied, folding the notice and slipping it into her back pocket. She had 30 days to come up with 3 months' back rent, $4,200 that might as well have been $4 million given her current circumstances. Elena Vasquez had been many things in her 34 years: valedictorian of her high school class, the first in her family to attend college, a certified aircraft maintenance technician with credentials from the Federal Aviation Administration, and for 6 years a senior mechanic at Denver International Airport. What she had never expected to become was a single mother living paycheck to paycheck, watching her world crumble one unpaid bill at a time. The layoffs at Horizon Aviation Services had come without warning 8 months earlier. Economic restructuring, they called it, a sterile corporate term that meant Elena and 47 other skilled technicians were suddenly expendable. Her supervisor had handed her the termination letter with genuine regret. Elena had been one of their best mechanics, capable of diagnosing problems that stumped technicians with twice her experience. But skill and dedication meant nothing when airlines were cutting costs and automating maintenance procedures. At 34, Elena found herself competing for entry-level positions with fresh graduates willing to work for half her previous salary. The unemployment benefits had run out 3 months ago. Since then, Elena had been surviving on a patchwork of part-time work, weekend shifts at an auto repair shop, evening tutoring sessions for high school students struggling with math and science, and the occasional freelance consulting job that barely covered groceries. Pride had kept her from asking her family for help, and practical reality made it impossible anyway. Her parents worked double shifts at a meatpacking plant in Greeley just to keep their own heads above water. More troubling than her financial crisis was the growing legal pressure from her ex-husband's family. Marcus Pemberton had walked out on Elena and Sofia 3 years ago, claiming he needed space to find himself. What he'd actually found was Rebecca Martinez, the daughter of a prominent Denver real estate developer, along with a convenient memory loss regarding his parental responsibilities. For 2 years, Marcus had been content to send sporadic child support payments and see Sofia every other weekend when it didn't interfere with his new social calendar. But 6 months ago, his tune had changed dramatically. Suddenly, he was concerned about Sofia's living conditions and educational opportunities. His lawyer had filed papers questioning Elena's fitness as a parent, citing her unemployment and increasingly precarious housing situation. The hearing was scheduled for next month. Marcus's family had hired one of Denver's most expensive family law firms, while Elena was representing herself with help from an overworked legal aid attorney who returned her calls only when absolutely necessary. The outcome seemed predetermined. The Pembertons had money, stability, and a legal system that favored traditional family structures over struggling single mothers. Elena had spent countless sleepless nights researching custody law, knowing that judges often looked favorably on fathers who could provide better financial security, private schools, and stable housing. The fact that Marcus had abandoned his family and shown minimal interest in Sofia for 3 years seemed less relevant than his current ability to provide material advantages. Sofia, blissfully unaware of the legal machinations threatening to uproot her life, had adapted to their reduced circumstances with the resilience that children somehow summoned in crisis. She helped Elena clip coupons, never complained about generic cereal or secondhand clothes, and had learned to entertain herself during Elena's long workdays with library books and educational television programs. "We're a team, right, Mama?" Sofia would say when Elena apologized for their tiny apartment or the lack of money for extras like movies or restaurants. Teams stick together no matter what. These moments of wisdom from her 10-year-old daughter often brought Elena to tears, both from pride and from the crushing weight of failing to provide the stability Sofia deserved. Every child should have security, opportunities, and a future bright with possibilities. Instead, Sofia was learning hard lessons about financial insecurity and the arbitrary cruelty of economic systems that could destroy families through no fault of their own. On the day the eviction notice arrived, Elena was returning from her 3rd job interview of the week, another rejection delivered with practiced corporate sympathy. The position at Rocky Mountain Airlines had seemed promising until they discovered she'd been unemployed for 8 months. "We're looking for someone with more recent experience," the hiring manager had explained, apparently forgetting that gaining recent experience required someone to hire you first. Sitting in her car outside the apartment building, Elena allowed herself 5 minutes of despair before plastering on the cheerful facade Sofia needed to see. She was mentally calculating how long their savings might last, 3 weeks if she was extremely careful, when she noticed another piece of mail tucked under her windshield wiper. The envelope bore the letterhead of Hutchinson, Bradley, and Associates, attorneys at law from Grand Junction, Colorado. Elena's first thought was that Marcus's legal team was expanding their harassment campaign, but the return address was unfamiliar. Inside the envelope was a formal letter dated 3 days earlier. "Dear Miss Vasquez, we represent the estate of Mrs. Carmen Dolores Vasquez, who passed away on February 15th of this year. Our records indicate that you are her granddaughter and sole surviving heir. Mrs. Vasquez has left you property consisting of 240 acres of forested land in the Uncompahgre National Forest area of western Colorado, along with mineral rights and any structures or contents thereon. The property is accessible via Forest Service Road 418, approximately 30 miles southeast of Grand Junction. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange for the transfer of deed and to discuss any questions regarding your inheritance. There are some unique circumstances regarding this property that require immediate attention. Sincerely, Robert Hutchinson, ESQ." Elena read the letter 3 times before its implications began to sink in. Carmen Vasquez, her father's mother, a woman Elena had met exactly twice in her lifetime during awkward family gatherings that ended in shouting matches between her father and grandmother. Carmen had been a mystery in their family, a woman who lived alone in the mountains and rarely spoke to her children or grandchildren. Elena's father, Miguel, had described his mother as stubborn, secretive, and impossible to please. The few times Carmen's name came up in conversation, it was usually in the context of explaining why she wouldn't be attending Christmas dinner or Sofia's birthday party. She made her choices, Miguel would say, with a mixture of hurt and resignation. Some people prefer being alone to being part of a family. Elena had always wondered about the story behind her grandmother's isolation, but family dynamics had made it impossible to build any relationship with Carmen. Now, apparently Carmen had made Elena her sole heir, a decision that seemed as mysterious as everything else about the woman. 240 acres of forest land. Elena had no idea what such property might be worth, but even if it was worth only a few $1,000s, it might be enough to buy time, to delay the eviction, to mount a better legal defense against Marcus's custody challenge. That evening, Elena called the law office and left a message requesting more information about the inheritance. When Robert Hutchinson returned her call the next morning, his tone was serious and slightly urgent. "Miss Vasquez, I'm glad you contacted us quickly. This inheritance comes with some unusual complications that we need to discuss in person. Your grandmother left specific instructions about the property that I'm not comfortable discussing over the phone." "What kind of complications?" Elena asked, cradling the phone between her shoulder and ear while making Sofia's lunch for school. "Historical complications," Hutchinson replied cryptically. "Items and information your grandmother preserved for decades, along with some rather dire warnings about keeping certain matters confidential. She was very specific that you should be made aware of these circumstances before deciding to accept the inheritance." Elena's heart sank. There was always a catch. "Are we talking about environmental problems? Contaminated land?" "Nothing like that," Hutchinson assured her. "But your grandmother was convinced that certain parties might have continued interest in the property, despite the passage of decades. She left detailed instructions about security precautions and, well, it's better if I show you her materials in person." They arranged to meet the following Friday at Hutchinson's office in Grand Junction, Colorado. Elena would need to take an unpaid day off from her part-time auto shop job and arrange childcare for Sofia. But if there was any chance this inheritance could improve their situation, she had to investigate. Friday morning brought an early spring snowstorm that made the 3-hour drive from Aurora to Grand Junction treacherous. Elena's 10-year-old Honda struggled with the mountain passes, and she found herself white-knuckling the steering wheel as semi-trucks roared past in clouds of road spray. She had left Sofia with her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher who sometimes watched the girl when Elena worked evening shifts. Mrs. Chen had asked no questions about her destination, but her knowing look suggested she understood the desperation driving Elena into the mountains during a snowstorm. "Family business," Elena had explained vaguely. "Should be back by evening." Grand Junction appeared through the storm like a mirage, a sprawling valley city surrounded by red rock formations that looked more like Arizona than Colorado. Elena had never spent time in this part of the state, which felt foreign and isolated compared to the Denver metropolitan area she knew. Hutchinson's law office occupied the second floor of a historic sandstone building downtown, its waiting room decorated with antique maps of western Colorado and framed photographs of the region's mining boom era. Elena was struck by how different this felt from the sterile corporate environments she'd grown accustomed to during her job search. Robert Hutchinson turned out to be a man in his 60s with silver hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. He greeted Elena with genuine warmth and immediately offered coffee and sandwiches, explaining that the storm had delayed several other appointments. "I appreciate you making the drive in this weather," he said, settling behind a desk covered with file folders and survey maps. "Your grandmother's estate is
unique in my 40 years of practice. Carmen was one of the most fascinating and frustrating clients I've ever worked with. He opened a thick folder labeled C. Vasquez Estate Planning and withdrew a letter written in careful script on aging stationery. Carmen wrote this letter to be given to you specifically along with the inheritance documents. She insisted that you read it before making any decisions about the property. Elena accepted the letter with trembling hands, recognizing immediately that this might be the longest communication she'd ever received from her estranged grandmother. My dear Elena, if you are reading this letter, I am gone, and you must now decide whether to continue carrying secrets that I have protected for 79 years. I know we were never close. Your father saw to that with his stubborn pride and refusal to understand what some sacrifices mean. The property I leave you contains more than trees and mountain views. Hidden in those woods is something that powerful people have been searching for since 1944, and something that could either make your family wealthy beyond imagination or put you in terrible danger. During World War II, I worked as a civilian contractor at various military installations across Colorado and Utah. In September 1944, I was asked to help with a special project involving the secure transport of classified materials from Los Alamos to an undisclosed location. What I witnessed and what I helped hide has haunted me for 8 decades. On the property, you will find a 1944 P-38 Lightning fighter aircraft deliberately hidden and preserved. Inside that aircraft are documents and materials that certain government officials believed were destroyed in a training accident. These materials relate to the early atomic weapons program and contain information that would embarrass powerful families and institutions even today. I chose to preserve these materials because they represent evidence of crimes committed against American citizens in the name of national security. But preserving them has required a lifetime of isolation and vigilance. People have come looking over the years, government agents, private investigators, treasure hunters. I turned them all away, but I am old now, and the secret needs a new guardian. You have 2 choices: sell the property without investigating what lies hidden there, or take on the responsibility of deciding what to do with evidence that could change American understanding of what happened during the Manhattan Project. Choose carefully, my granddaughter. Some knowledge is more burden than blessing. With love and regret for the years we lost, Carmen Dolores Vasquez. Elena's hands shook as she finished reading. She looked up to find Hutchinson watching her with grave attention. "Did you know what was in this letter?" she asked. Hutchinson nodded slowly. "Your grandmother shared some details with me when we updated her will last year. She was very concerned about what would happen to the property after her death. She'd received several inquiries from government agencies and private parties over the years, all asking for historical materials that might be located on her land." "And you believe her story about hidden aircraft and classified documents?" "I've been to the property, Elena. I've seen the plane. Your grandmother wasn't suffering from dementia or delusions. Whatever she hid in those woods, it's real, and it's been preserved remarkably well." Elena felt a surge of vertigo. 8 months ago, she was a skilled aircraft mechanic with a stable career and a comfortable apartment. Now she was unemployed, facing eviction and a custody battle, and apparently inheriting government secrets and a hidden World War II fighter plane. "What kind of legal implications are we talking about if I decide to investigate this property?" she asked. Hutchinson leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Your grandmother owned the land outright with clear title going back to 1943. Whatever is on that property legally belongs to you. However, if there are indeed classified government materials involved, that could complicate matters considerably." He withdrew another document from the folder. "Your grandmother also left this, a detailed map of the property showing the location of the aircraft and what she called security precautions she'd put in place. She was convinced that the wrong people learning about this discovery could be dangerous. Elena studied the hand-drawn map, noting trails, landmarks, and what appeared to be the location of a camouflaged aircraft hidden in a remote valley. Her grandmother had included detailed notes about approach routes, seasonal access limitations, and what looked like early warning systems she'd installed over the years. She really was worried about people coming to search for this, Elena murmured. Very worried, Hutchinson confirmed. She mentioned receiving visits from people claiming to be historians, government archivists, and private collectors, all asking about wartime activities in the area. She turned them all away, but she kept detailed records of these encounters. He showed Elena a logbook filled with dates, descriptions of visitors, and license plate numbers spanning several decades. Carmen had been methodical about documenting anyone who showed interest in her property or asked questions about its history. The most recent entry was just 6 months ago. A man claiming to represent a military history foundation asking about recovery of historical aircraft for museum display. Your grandmother noted that he seemed far too interested in whether she lived alone and what security measures she had in place. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. If people were still actively searching for whatever was hidden on the property, her decision to investigate could indeed be dangerous. But dangerous for whom? For herself or for Sofia? And what if the materials hidden in the aircraft could provide the financial security her family desperately needed? That evening, Elena sat in a Grand Junction motel room, surrounded by the inheritance documents, maps, and photographs Hutchinson had provided. The storm had intensified, making the return drive to Aurora impossible until morning. But the delay gave her time to process the enormity of her grandmother's revelation. The photographs were particularly striking. Black and white images of the hidden aircraft taken by Carmen over the years, showing its gradual concealment beneath growing trees and carefully arranged camouflage. Even in the grainy photos, Elena could see that this was indeed a P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter aircraft used extensively during World War II. As an aircraft mechanic, Elena knew that P-38s were valuable collector's items in restored condition, even without any historical significance. A complete aircraft with wartime documentation could be worth far more. But, according to Carmen's letter, the real value lay not in the aircraft itself, but in what it contained. Elena called Sofia to say goodnight, fighting to keep her voice normal as her daughter chattered about her day at school and the snow fort she'd built with Mrs. Chen. Sofia's innocent excitement about everyday pleasures reminded Elena of what was really at stake, not just her own financial survival, but her daughter's future and security. "When are you coming home, Mama?" Sofia asked. "Tomorrow morning, sweetheart. The roads are too snowy tonight." "I miss you. Mrs. Chen makes good cookies, but they're not as good as yours." Elena smiled despite her anxiety. "I'll make you cookies tomorrow night, I promise." After hanging up, Elena returned to Carmen's materials, including a detailed journal her grandmother had kept during the war years. The entries from 1944 painted a picture of a young woman working in extraordinary circumstances. September 12, 1944. Arrived at the Alamosa facility for special assignment. Security is unlike anything I've seen before. Armed guards, multiple checkpoints, scientists who look like they haven't slept in weeks. September 15, 1944. Witnessed something today that I'm not supposed to write about, but I need to remember every detail. Dr. Kellerman showed me documents related to radiation exposure experiments being conducted on civilians without their knowledge. Prisoners, hospital patients, even children in state institutions, all in the name of understanding atomic radiation effects. September 18, 1944. Captain Morrison approached me privately, says he has evidence of criminal activity by senior project officials, but he needs help getting the documents to safety before he can approach authorities. Asked if I would help hide materials temporarily on family land in Colorado. September 22, 1944. Morrison never made it to our meeting point. Found out later he was killed in what they're calling a training accident with his P-38. But I know he was flying to meet me when he crashed. The documents he carried were supposedly destroyed in the fire. September 30th, 1944. Except they weren't destroyed. Morrison had already hidden them in a sealed compartment in his aircraft before takeoff, and I was the only person who knew where he was planning to land. September 30th, 1944. Recovered Morrison's aircraft and the materials he died trying to protect. Moved everything to the property grandfather left me. If Morrison was killed for trying to expose these crimes, the evidence needs to stay hidden until it's safe to reveal the truth. Elena read the journal entries with growing amazement and horror. If Carmen's account was accurate, the hidden aircraft contained evidence of illegal human radiation experiments conducted during the Manhattan Project, crimes that had never been prosecuted or even acknowledged publicly.
She thought about her current circumstances: unemployment, eviction, custody battle, financial ruin. Against that backdrop, Carmen's inheritance represented either salvation or catastrophe, depending on how she chose to proceed. The safe option would be to sell the property without investigating the aircraft. Hutchison had indicated that the land alone might be worth $150,000 to $200,000, enough to solve Elena's immediate problems and provide a foundation for rebuilding her life. She could pay off her debts, rent a decent apartment, hire a better lawyer for the custody case, and give Sofia the stability she deserved. But the other option, investigating the aircraft and the materials it contained, offered the possibility of something far greater. If the documents were authentic and historically significant, they could be worth millions. Elena could secure not just temporary stability, but generational wealth that would guarantee Sofia's future. The risk, of course, was that Carmen's warnings about danger were justified. If people had been killed to protect these secrets in 1944, what would happen to someone who threatened to expose them today? Elena spent a sleepless night weighing her options, alternately convinced that she should play it safe and desperate to believe that her grandmother's legacy could transform their lives. By morning, the storm had cleared, and weak sunlight was filtering through the motel room curtains. Her decision, when it finally crystallized, surprised her with its clarity. She would investigate the property and the aircraft, but carefully and methodically. As an aircraft mechanic, she had the skills to assess the plane's condition and contents safely. As a mother facing an impossible situation, she had the motivation to take calculated risks for Sofia's future. But first, she needed to prepare thoroughly. If Carmen's precautions and warnings were justified, Elena couldn't afford to approach this casually. Over the next week, Elena threw herself into research with the same methodical approach she'd applied to aircraft maintenance. She studied everything she could find about P-38 Lightning aircraft, World War II history in Colorado, and the Manhattan Project's lesser-known activities. What she discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. The Manhattan Project had indeed conducted numerous experiments beyond atomic weapons development, including studies of radiation effects on human subjects. Many of these experiments were later acknowledged as unethical and illegal, but most of the perpetrators had never faced consequences. Elena also researched the specific aircraft mentioned in Carmen's journal, a P-38 L5LO Lightning, serial number 4426761, piloted by Captain James Morrison. According to official records, Morrison had died in a training accident in September 1944 when his aircraft crashed in remote mountains during a routine navigation exercise. The plane and its contents were listed as destroyed by impact and fire. But Carmen's journal suggested a very different story. Morrison had been deliberately targeted, his aircraft recovered and hidden before official search teams could locate it. If true, the destroyed P-38 and its contents had been preserved for 80 years, waiting for someone to uncover the truth about what Morrison had died trying to expose. Elena's research also revealed the disturbing scope of wartime human experiments. Project 4.1, which studied radiation effects on Marshall Islands residents after atomic tests. Experiments at Vanderbilt University, where pregnant women were given radioactive iron.
Studies at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where mentally disabled children were fed radioactive oatmeal. All conducted without informed consent, all later acknowledged as gross violations of medical ethics. If Morrison had possessed evidence of similar experiments, his murder and the cover-up would represent one of the most significant historical conspiracies of the 20th century. The implications were staggering, not just for historical understanding, but for the families of victims who had never received acknowledgement or compensation. Elena also began practical preparations for investigating the property. She researched the current weather conditions in the Uncompahgre National Forest, purchased topographical maps of the area, and assembled equipment she would need for a careful examination of the aircraft: digital cameras, metal detectors, basic tools, and camping supplies for an extended stay. Most importantly, she took security precautions that Carmen's experience suggested were necessary. Elena opened a safety deposit box at a bank in Aurora and deposited copies of all the inheritance documents, Carmen's journal, and a detailed letter explaining her plans. If something happened to her, at least there would be a record of what she had discovered. She also made arrangements for Sofia's care in case the investigation took longer than expected. Mrs. Chen agreed to watch Sofia for up to a week, and Elena prepared detailed instructions about school schedules, emergency contacts, and what to do if Elena didn't return when expected. The custody hearing with Marcus was still 3 weeks away, giving Elena a narrow window to investigate the property and determine what options it might provide. If the aircraft contained valuable historical materials, she would need time to document everything carefully and consult with experts about authentication and legal implications. Elena's final preparation was perhaps the most difficult, deciding how much to tell Sofia about what she was planning.
January 15th. Vehicle with government plates observed on Forest Service Road 418. Stopped at property gate for approximately 20 minutes before continuing up mountain. January 22nd. Helicopter overflight, circling property twice. Military markings but too distant to identify specific unit. February 3rd. Motion sensors triggered near north boundary. Found evidence of foot travel but no sign of attempted entry. Increased patrol schedule. February 10th. Radio intercepts suggesting renewed official interest in historical recovery operations in this area. Time may be running short. Elena felt a chill reading these final entries. If Carmen's suspicions were correct, government agents or other interested parties might still be monitoring the area, waiting for an opportunity to search the property now that its longtime guardian was gone. After settling into the cabin and securing her vehicle, Elena studied Carmen's map more carefully. The aircraft was hidden in what her grandmother called Morrison's Valley, accessible by a hiking trail that began behind the cabin and wound through dense forest for approximately 1 mile. Carmen had included detailed notes about the trail, including seasonal hazards, difficult sections, and what she called verification points, landmarks that would confirm Elena was following the correct route. More ominously, the map also showed locations where Carmen had installed motion sensors and cameras to monitor for unauthorized visitors. Elena spent her first afternoon hiking the trail without equipment, simply familiarizing herself with the route and assessing the challenges she would face when carrying tools and supplies to the aircraft site. The trail was well maintained, but challenging, requiring careful navigation through rocky sections and steep grades. As she climbed higher into the mountains, Elena began to understand why Carmen's secret had remained hidden for so many decades. The terrain was rugged enough to discourage casual exploration, while the dense forest provided natural camouflage for anything deliberately concealed. The trail's final section led to an overlook above a small valley surrounded by towering peaks. Elena consulted Carmen's map and realized she was looking down into Morrison's Valley, a natural bowl perhaps half a mile across, filled with old-growth trees and dominated by a small stream that wound across the valley floor. From this vantage point, Elena could see no obvious signs of human activity or hidden aircraft. Carmen's camouflage had been remarkably effective. Only someone with precise knowledge of the aircraft's location would have any chance of finding it among the dense forest growth. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the valley, Elena made her way back to the cabin to prepare for the next day's investigation. Tomorrow, she would hike down into Morrison's Valley and finally confront the secret her grandmother had protected for 8 decades. That evening, Elena sat beside the cabin's fireplace, reading through Carmen's journals and trying to imagine what her grandmother had experienced during all those years of isolation and vigilance. Carmen had sacrificed a normal family life to protect evidence of wartime crimes, choosing duty to historical truth over personal relationships. Elena thought about Sofia, safe in Aurora with Mrs. Chen, but growing up without extended family connections because of the rifts and secrets that had divided previous generations. If Elena could successfully preserve and reveal Carmen's evidence, perhaps she could finally heal those divisions while securing her daughter's future. But first, she needed to find and document whatever Captain Morrison had died trying to protect. The aircraft was waiting in the valley below, along with answers that had remained hidden since 1944. Elena fell asleep to the sound of wind in the pine trees and the distant call of owls, steeling herself for whatever tomorrow's investigation might reveal. The most challenging part of her journey was about to begin. Elena woke before dawn on Wednesday morning, her body clock still adjusting to the mountain altitude and the profound silence of the wilderness. The cabin's windows revealed a world transformed by overnight frost. Every surface glittered with ice crystals that would vanish within hours as the sun climbed above the surrounding peaks. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and energy bars, Elena gathered her equipment for the descent into Morrison's Valley. She had spent the evening organizing her approach methodically. Digital camera with extra batteries, basic hand tools, metal detector, sample containers, and Carmen's detailed notes about the aircraft's location and condition. The hiking trail proved more challenging in the early morning light than it had been during her reconnaissance the afternoon before. Frost made the rocky sections treacherous, and Elena found herself moving slowly and carefully, conscious that a twisted ankle or fall could leave her stranded miles from help with no cell phone coverage. But as the sun climbed higher and the frost began to sublimate into wisps of vapor, the forest revealed its spectacular beauty. Ancient pine and fir trees towered overhead, their trunks scarred by decades of lightning strikes and winter storms. Elena spotted fresh elk tracks in the soft earth and caught glimpses of deer moving through the trees like shadows. Carmen's verification points proved invaluable for navigation. A distinctive rock formation here, a lightning split tree there, each one confirming that Elena was following the correct route toward the hidden aircraft. Her grandmother had been remarkably thorough in documenting every aspect of the trail, including seasonal variations in vegetation and potential hazards.
The final descent into Morrison's Valley required careful route finding through a maze of fallen logs and rocky outcroppings. Elena consulted Carmen's map frequently, noting landmarks and adjusting her approach based on her grandmother's detailed instructions. The sound of running water grew louder as she approached the valley floor, where a small stream wound between stands of old-growth trees. According to Carmen's notes, the aircraft was concealed in a natural clearing approximately 300 yards from the stream, hidden beneath decades of accumulated camouflage and natural forest growth. Elena began her search using the metal detector, moving in systematic grid patterns while watching for any signs of human activity or artificial materials. The metal detector's first significant reading came from what appeared to be a natural grove of aspen trees, their white bark gleaming in the dappled sunlight. But as Elena moved closer, she began to notice subtle irregularities. Too perfect spacing between certain trees, metal objects partially buried beneath accumulated leaves and forest debris, and what looked like the edge of a tarpaulin that had been carefully camouflaged with natural materials. Elena's heart began racing as she realized she was looking at Carmen's handiwork, decades of patient effort to conceal something extraordinary in plain sight. Her grandmother had used the natural forest growth to create camouflage so effective that the aircraft was invisible until you knew exactly where to look. Working carefully, Elena began removing layers of accumulated debris, branches, leaves, moss, and weathered canvas that had been arranged to mimic natural forest floor. What emerged was like archaeological excavation in reverse, each layer revealing more evidence of the remarkable preservation effort Carmen had maintained for 8 decades. The first recognizable aircraft component Elena uncovered was a section of aluminum wing, still bearing faded military markings despite its age. The metal showed surprisingly little corrosion, protected by Carmen's careful maintenance and the dry mountain air. As Elena continued working, more of the aircraft's outline became visible. The distinctive twin-boom configuration of a P-38 Lightning fighter plane. But this was clearly no ordinary wartime aircraft. Even before fully exposing the fuselage, she could see evidence of significant modifications. Additional radio equipment had been installed in compartments that should have contained ammunition. The pilot's seat had been removed and replaced with what appeared to be custom storage units. Most significantly, the aircraft's weight distribution was completely wrong for a fighter plane. This machine had been converted for cargo transport, not aerial combat. After 3 hours of careful excavation, Elena had exposed enough of the aircraft to confirm everything Carmen had described in her letters and journals. This was indeed Captain James Morrison's P-38L-5-LO Lightning, serial number 44-26761, the aircraft that had supposedly been destroyed in a training accident in September 1944. The preservation was remarkable. Protected from weather and carefully maintained by Carmen over the decades, the aircraft looked as though it could have landed in the valley just weeks earlier rather than 8 decades ago. Paint was faded but intact, control surfaces moved freely when Elena tested them, and the cockpit instruments appeared functional despite their age. But the most extraordinary discovery came when Elena began examining the modified cargo compartments that had replaced the aircraft's original military equipment. Using a flashlight to peer inside the sealed units, she could see document containers, metal boxes, and what appeared to be photographic equipment, all carefully preserved in moisture-proof packaging. Elena's hands shook as she photographed everything from multiple angles, documenting the aircraft's condition and the evidence of its cargo before attempting to access any of the sealed compartments. As an aircraft mechanic, she understood the importance of systematic documentation before disturbing any original materials. The cargo access panels were secured with military specification locks that somehow survived 8 decades in the mountains. Elena examined them carefully, noting that they appeared to be a 2-part security system. Some compartments could be opened with basic tools, while others required what looked like specialized keys or combinations. Working methodically, Elena began with the compartments that seemed most accessible. The first panel she managed to open contained a waterproof case filled with documents protected by multiple layers of oiled cloth and early plastic sheeting. Even with these precautions, she could see that the papers were yellowed with age but still legible. The top document was a handwritten letter dated September 21, 1944, addressed to whoever recovers these materials. I am Captain James Morrison, United States Army Air Forces, serial number 0794432. If you are reading this letter, I am likely dead, and the materials in this aircraft represent evidence of crimes committed against American citizens by officials within the Manhattan Project. For the past 8 months, I have served as a courier pilot transporting classified materials between Los Alamos, New Mexico, and various research facilities across the western United States. During this duty, I have witnessed and documented systematic violations of medical ethics, including radiation experiments conducted on unwilling subjects without their knowledge or consent. The documents preserved in this aircraft include medical records, photographs, film footage, and correspondence proving that project officials have deliberately exposed American citizens to dangerous levels of radiation in order to study the effects of atomic weapons on human physiology. Subjects have included prisoners, hospital patients, mentally disabled individuals, and children in state institutions. I attempted to bring these crimes to the attention of my superior officers, but was told that national security required absolute secrecy about all project activities. When I persisted in demanding investigation, I was reassigned to special courier duties that I now realize were intended to isolate me from other personnel who might support my concerns. I believe my life is in danger because of what I have witnessed and documented. If these materials are recovered after my death, I pray that someone with more courage than my superior officers will ensure that the truth is revealed and the perpetrators held accountable. The complete evidence is organized in the compartments of this aircraft as follows: medical records in compartment A, photographic evidence in compartment B, film footage in compartment C, and correspondence with project officials in compartment D. Additional materials are stored in the modified ammunition compartments. May God forgive us all for what we have allowed to happen in the name of national security. Captain James Morrison, September 21, 1944. Elena sat back on her heels, stunned by the implications of Morrison's letter. If his claims were accurate, the aircraft contained evidence of systematic human rights violations committed during the Manhattan Project, crimes that had never been prosecuted or even publicly acknowledged. The historical significance was staggering. Elena knew from her research that the U.S. government had eventually admitted to conducting unethical radiation experiments during the Cold War era. But those acknowledgments had been limited and incomplete. Morrison's evidence could provide detailed documentation of the scope and systematic nature of these crimes. More immediately relevant to Elena's situation, such evidence would be invaluable to historians, journalists, and legal advocates seeking to understand the full extent of government misconduct during the atomic weapons program. The materials could be worth millions of dollars, but more importantly, they could provide justice for victims and their families who had never received acknowledgement or compensation. Elena carefully photographed Morrison's letter and returned it to its protective wrapping before examining the other accessible compartments. Each one revealed additional evidence carefully preserved and organized: medical charts documenting radiation exposure levels, photographs showing the effects of experimental treatments, and correspondence between project officials discussing the ethics and legality of their activities. One particularly disturbing series of documents described experiments conducted at a facility in Utah where prisoners were deliberately exposed to radiation and then monitored for symptoms without receiving medical treatment. The subjects were told they were participating in routine medical examinations while actually serving as human test subjects for atomic weapons research. Another set of materials documented experiments at a hospital in Colorado, where patients undergoing treatment for various conditions were given radioactive injections without their knowledge. The medical staff recorded detailed observations of radiation sickness symptoms, while the patients and their families remained unaware of what was happening. Elena found herself fighting back tears as she read through Morrison's carefully documented evidence. These weren't abstract historical events. They were crimes committed against real people, individuals who had trusted their government and medical system, only to be betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. As Elena worked through the afternoon, Elena began to understand why Morrison had been willing to risk his life to preserve this evidence, and why Carmen had spent 80 years protecting it from discovery. The scope of the crimes was so extensive and the cover-up so systematic that revealing the truth would have massive implications for American understanding of government accountability and medical ethics. But Elena also began to understand why Carmen had been so concerned about security and potential retaliation. If government officials had been willing to murder Morrison to suppress this evidence in 1944, what would they do to anyone who threatened to expose it today? As the afternoon sun began slanting low through the forest canopy, Elena made the difficult decision to halt her documentation for the day. She had photographed and catalogued materials from 3 of the aircraft's accessible compartments, but several others remained sealed with locks she couldn't open using basic tools. More importantly, she was beginning to feel exposed and vulnerable in the remote valley. Carmen's warnings about ongoing surveillance suddenly seemed less paranoid and more prescient. If people were still actively searching for Morrison's evidence, Elena's presence at the aircraft site could attract exactly the kind of attention her grandmother had spent decades avoiding. Elena carefully restored the camouflage over the aircraft, using Carmen's detailed notes to ensure that the concealment looked natural and undisturbed. Her grandmother's system was ingenious. Someone could stand within 20 feet of the hidden plane and see nothing but typical forest growth.
The hike back to the cabin proved more challenging than the morning descent, as Elena was now carrying additional equipment and documentary materials while navigating the steep trail in fading light. By the time she reached the cabin, her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and her mind was reeling from the implications of what she had discovered. That evening, Elena spread Morrison's documents across the cabin's main table and began organizing them by category and chronological order. The systematic nature of the evidence was both impressive and horrifying. Morrison had clearly been conducting a thorough investigation of Manhattan Project activities for months before his death. The medical records were particularly disturbing. Elena found detailed charts documenting radiation exposure levels for hundreds of subjects, including children as young as 8 years old. The experiments had been conducted at facilities across the American West, with subjects selected from vulnerable populations unlikely to question authority or demand accountability. Prison inmates comprised the largest category of test subjects, but the documents also described experiments on hospital patients, residents of mental institutions, and members of Native American communities who had been told they were receiving routine medical care. In each case, the subjects were deliberately kept ignorant of the true nature of the procedures they underwent. The photographic evidence was even more damning. Morrison had somehow obtained pictures showing the effects of radiation exposure on human subjects, images of radiation burns, hair loss, and other symptoms that had been systematically documented by project medical staff. The photographs were clearly intended for scientific analysis rather than patient care, treating human beings as laboratory specimens. Elena found herself particularly affected by photographs of children who had been subjected to radiation experiments at a facility she recognized as being located near Denver. These young subjects had been residents of a state institution for mentally disabled children, selected for experimentation because their families were unlikely to question medical procedures or demand detailed explanations. The correspondence between project officials was perhaps the most damning evidence of all, as it showed that senior administrators were fully aware of the ethical and legal problems with their human experiments but chose to proceed anyway. One exchange between 2 Manhattan project directors explicitly discussed the need to select experimental subjects who would be unlikely to cause legal complications if adverse effects occurred. Another series of letters revealed that some project physicians had raised concerns about the ethics of conducting experiments without informed consent, only to be told that national security considerations overrode normal medical ethics. When one doctor threatened to report the experiments to civilian authorities, he was immediately transferred to a remote facility and his security clearance was revoked.
As Elena read through hour after hour of documentary evidence, she began to understand that Morrison had uncovered something far more systematic and extensive than isolated incidents of unethical research. This was evidence of a coordinated program of human experimentation that had violated the most basic principles of medical ethics and human rights. The scope of the cover-up was equally staggering. The documents showed that officials at the highest levels of the Manhattan Project were aware of the experiments and had actively worked to suppress information about them. When subjects became ill or died, their deaths were attributed to pre-existing conditions or unrelated causes. Families were told that their loved ones had received the best possible medical care. Elena realized that she was looking at evidence of what amounted to systematic crimes against humanity, committed by the U.S. government against its own citizens during World War II. The implications for American history and government accountability were enormous, but the personal implications for Elena were equally daunting. Morrison had been killed for trying to expose these crimes, and Carmen had spent 8 decades living in isolation to protect his evidence. Now Elena had to decide what to do with information that could either secure her family's future or destroy their lives entirely. The financial value of the materials was potentially enormous. Historical documents of this significance and controversy could be worth millions to collectors, museums, or media organizations. The aircraft itself, as the only surviving example associated with such important historical events, would be invaluable to aviation museums and private collectors. More importantly, Elena recognized that she had a moral obligation to consider the victims of these experiments and their families. Many of the subjects documented in Morrison's evidence had died without ever knowing what had been done to them. Their families had been denied the truth about their loved ones' suffering and death. Revealing Morrison's evidence could finally provide acknowledgement and potential compensation for these historical injustices. But Elena also had to consider the risks to herself and Sofia. Carmen's journal entries suggested that government agencies were still actively monitoring the area and searching for Morrison's evidence. If Elena attempted to publicize what she had found, she could face retaliation from powerful interests who preferred to keep these historical crimes buried. As Elena pondered these competing considerations, Elena's satellite phone rang, a jarring intrusion of modern technology into her contemplation of historical crimes. The caller ID showed Mrs. Chen's number, and Elena felt a surge of panic about Sofia's safety.
"Elena, dear, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Mrs. Chen said when Elena answered. "Sofia is fine, but there's something you should know. A man came to your apartment today asking questions about your whereabouts." Elena's blood ran cold. "What kind of man? What did he want?" "He said he was from a government agency investigating historical property claims. He wanted to know if you had received any inheritance recently and whether you had traveled to investigate any property in western Colorado." "Did you tell him anything?" "Of course not," Mrs. Chen replied with characteristic firmness. "I told him I was just a neighbor who occasionally watched Sofia and that I knew nothing about your business affairs. But, Elena, he seemed very interested in the timing of your trip and whether you had taken any equipment or supplies with you." Elena felt the walls closing in. Somehow, someone had connected her inheritance to Morrison's hidden evidence. Perhaps they had been monitoring Robert Hutchinson's law office, or maybe they had surveillance on Carmen's property that had detected Elena's arrival. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to take Sofia and stay somewhere else tonight. Do you have family or friends who could put you up?" "Elena, you're scaring me. What kind of trouble are you in?" "I'm not sure yet, but I need to know that Sofia is safe while I figure out my options. Please, just take her somewhere that man can't find her and call me when you're both secure." After hanging up, Elena sat in the cabin's growing darkness, contemplating her rapidly deteriorating situation. She had found evidence that could transform her family's circumstances, but pursuing it appeared to put Sofia at risk. The same forces that had killed Morrison and driven Carmen into decades of isolation were apparently still active and still determined to suppress the truth about historical human experiments. Elena realized that she had reached a crucial decision point. She could abandon her investigation, return to Aurora, and try to resume her normal life while hoping that the mysterious government agents would lose interest in her family. Or she could continue documenting Morrison's evidence and pursue the truth despite the obvious dangers. The choice would determine not only her own future, but Sofia's as well. Elena thought about her daughter's innocent trust that her mother would always protect her, and about the desperate financial circumstances that had driven Elena to investigate Carmen's inheritance in the first place. As night fell over the Colorado wilderness, Elena made her decision. She would complete her documentation of Morrison's evidence, but she would also take every possible precaution to ensure Sofia's safety. If powerful forces wanted to suppress the truth about historical human experiments, they would have to confront a determined mother who had already lost too much to be intimidated by threats. Tomorrow, Elena would return to Morrison's Valley and unlock the remaining secrets hidden in the modified P-38 Lightning. But first, she needed to ensure that Sofia was safe and that Elena's own investigation was properly documented in case something happened to her. The ghost plane had kept its secrets for 80 years. Elena was determined that the truth would finally emerge regardless of who preferred to keep it buried in the Colorado mountains. Elena spent a sleepless night organizing her priorities and developing contingency plans for multiple scenarios. By dawn, she had established secure communication protocols with Mrs. Chen, hidden backup copies of Morrison's documents in multiple locations around the cabin, and prepared detailed instructions for what should happen if she failed to return from the aircraft site. Mrs. Chen called at 6 a.m. to report that she and Sofia were staying with her sister in Boulder, safely away from anyone who might be monitoring Elena's apartment. Sofia didn't fully understand the need for secrecy, but she trusted her mother's judgment and had adapted to the adventure with typical childhood resilience. "When are you coming home, Mama?" Sofia asked when Mrs. Chen put her on the phone. "Soon, sweetheart. I just need to finish some important work here, and then we'll be together again." "Are you finding treasure in the mountains?" Elena smiled, despite her anxiety. "Something like that, baby. Something that might help our family for a long time." After securing communications with Sofia, Elena prepared for what might be her final day at the aircraft site. She gathered tools for opening the remaining sealed compartments, extra documentation materials, and emergency supplies in case she needed to remain hidden in the forest for an extended period. The morning hike to Morrison's Valley felt different now that Elena knew she was potentially being hunted. She moved more carefully, watching for any signs of surveillance or unauthorized activity, and took a circuitous route that would make it difficult for anyone to track her movements. The hidden aircraft appeared exactly as she had left it, but Elena noticed fresh tire tracks on the Forest Service road that suggested other vehicles had passed through the area during the night. Her paranoia might be justified after all. Working with renewed urgency, Elena focused on the compartments she hadn't been able to access during her previous visit. Using tools she had borrowed from Carmen's cabin workshop, she managed to force open 2 additional storage units that contained even more damaging evidence of Manhattan Project crimes.
The first newly opened compartment contained what appeared to be Morrison's personal investigation files, detailed summaries of interviews he had conducted with project personnel who were willing to discuss unethical activities. Several scientists and medical staff had apparently confided in Morrison about their concerns regarding human experimentation, but had been too frightened of retaliation to make formal complaints. One interview transcript was particularly revealing.
Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a physician assigned to monitor radiation exposure in experimental subjects, had told Morrison that she had been ordered to falsify medical records to conceal evidence of radiation sickness. When subjects developed severe symptoms, their conditions were attributed to pre-existing health problems rather than experimental treatments. "I became a doctor to help people, not to participate in torturing them," Dr. Kellerman had told Morrison. But they made it clear that questioning project policies could be considered treason. "I have a family to protect, Captain. I can't risk being labeled a security threat." Another interview described experiments conducted on prisoners who had been told they were participating in routine medical examinations. The subjects were given radioactive injections and then monitored for symptoms without receiving any treatment for radiation sickness. Several prisoners had died during the experiments, but their deaths were listed as being caused by unrelated conditions. The second compartment Elena opened contained perhaps the most shocking evidence of all: film footage that Morrison had somehow obtained showing actual human experiments in progress. Using a portable film viewer she found among Carmen's equipment, Elena watched grainy black-and-white footage of medical procedures being conducted on unwilling subjects. The images were almost too disturbing to process. Elena watched as children were given radioactive injections while being told they were receiving vitamins. She saw prisoners being exposed to radiation sources while medical personnel and protective equipment observed from behind lead shields. Most horrifying of all, she witnessed the systematic documentation of human suffering as project staff recorded the effects of radiation exposure with clinical detachment. One particularly damning piece of footage showed a meeting of senior Manhattan Project officials discussing the need to expand human experimentation to gather more comprehensive data about radiation effects. The officials spoke casually about selecting experimental subjects from disposable populations who were unlikely to cause legal complications if adverse effects occurred. Elena realized that Morrison's evidence documented not just isolated incidents of unethical research, but a systematic program of human experimentation that had been approved and coordinated at the highest levels of the atomic weapons program. The scope of the crimes was far greater than anything that had ever been publicly acknowledged. As she documented the film footage, Elena began to understand why Morrison had been willing to risk his life to preserve this evidence and why government officials had been willing to commit murder to suppress it. The material she was viewing provided irrefutable proof of crimes against humanity committed by the U.S. government against its own citizens. The implications for American history and government accountability were staggering. If Morrison's evidence were made public, it would force a complete reassessment of Manhattan Project ethics and potentially lead to criminal prosecutions of surviving officials. More importantly, it could provide long-overdue justice for the victims of these experiments and their families. But Elena also recognized that the same factors that had made this evidence dangerous in 1944 could make it equally dangerous today. Government agencies, military contractors, and academic institutions that had participated in or benefited from the human experiments would have strong incentives to prevent public disclosure of Morrison's documentation. As Elena worked through the afternoon, systematically photographing and cataloging Morrison's evidence, she became increasingly aware of sounds in the forest around her. Twice she heard what sounded like helicopter engines in the distance, and once she was certain she detected voices carrying through the trees from somewhere uphill. Her paranoia proved justified when she heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles approaching on the forest service road. Elena quickly secured the most critical documents in a waterproof pack, restored the aircraft's camouflage as best she could in the limited time available, and retreated to a concealed observation point among the trees. 3 black SUVs with government license plates parked at the trailhead leading to Morrison's Valley.
Elena watched through binoculars as 8 men in tactical gear emerged from the vehicles and began organizing what was clearly a search operation. Their equipment included metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and what appeared to be sophisticated radio communication gear.
Elena realized that her worst fears were coming true. Government agents had somehow tracked her to Carmen's property and were now conducting an organized search for Morrison's evidence. If they had sophisticated detection equipment, it might be only a matter of time before they located the hidden aircraft. More troubling, Elena was now trapped in Morrison's Valley with no clear escape route. The search team was positioned between her and the trail leading back to Carmen's cabin, and their radio communications suggested they were coordinating with additional personnel who might be approaching from other directions. Elena quickly assessed her options. She could attempt to evade the search team and make her way back to the cabin through the wilderness, but that would mean abandoning Morrison's evidence to government agents who would likely suppress it permanently. Alternatively, she could remain hidden and hope the searchers would fail to locate the aircraft, but that would leave her stranded without supplies and with no way to contact help if the situation deteriorated. The choice Elena made would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of evidence that could finally provide justice for the victims of government crimes committed 8 decades earlier. As Elena watched the search team deploy across Morrison's Valley, she realized that the ghost plane's secrets were about to be discovered by exactly the people who had the strongest interest in keeping them buried. The confrontation that had begun in 1944 with Captain Morrison's murder was about to reach its climax in the Colorado wilderness, with Elena and her family's future hanging in the balance. Elena spent 2 hours crouched behind a fallen log, watching the government search team methodically work their way across Morrison's Valley. Their professional efficiency was both impressive and terrifying. These were clearly experienced operatives who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to find it. The team leader directed his men using hand signals and low-voiced radio communications, maintaining operational security that suggested they were concerned about electronic surveillance. Elena couldn't hear specific instructions, but their search pattern was systematic and thorough, moving in overlapping grids that would eventually cover every square yard of the valley floor. As the afternoon wore on, Elena realized with growing dread that the search team was making steady progress toward the aircraft's hidden location. Their metal detectors had already identified several promising targets, and they were using ground-penetrating radar to investigate anomalies beneath the forest floor. More troubling, additional personnel were arriving to expand the search operation. Elena watched as 2 more vehicles approached, bringing what appeared to be technical specialists and additional equipment. Someone was treating this as a high-priority operation with significant resources allocated to ensure success. Elena faced an impossible choice. She could attempt to evade the search team and make her way back to the cabin through the wilderness, but that would mean abandoning Morrison's evidence to government agents who would almost certainly suppress it permanently. Alternatively, she could remain hidden and hope the searchers would fail to locate the aircraft, despite their sophisticated equipment and systematic approach. But as Elena watched the searchers work their way inexorably toward Morrison's hiding place, she realized that escape might no longer be possible even if she chose to abandon the evidence. The search team had positioned personnel at key points around the valley perimeter, effectively creating a containment zone that would make it very difficult for anyone to leave undetected. Elena's satellite phone vibrated with an incoming text message from Mrs. Chen. Men came to sister's house asking about Sofia. We moved to different location. Call when safe. Elena's blood ran cold. The government agents weren't just searching for Morrison's evidence, they were actively pressuring Elena's family to force her cooperation. The fact that they had tracked Sofia to Mrs. Chen's sister's house suggested surveillance capabilities far beyond what Elena had imagined. She quickly composed a reply. Do not return home. Stay hidden. We'll contact you when situation resolved. As Elena was sending the message, she heard one of the searchers call out in excitement.
Looking through her binoculars, she could see that the team had discovered something significant. Their metal detector readings had led them to what appeared to be the edge of the aircraft's concealed location. Elena watched in horrified fascination as the search team began carefully removing the camouflage that Carmen had maintained for 8 decades. Layer by layer, they exposed the hidden P-38 Lightning, their professional excitement obvious even from Elena's distant observation point. The team leader approached the aircraft and began photographing it from multiple angles while speaking rapidly into his radio. Elena could see additional vehicles arriving at the trailhead, suggesting that the discovery had triggered some kind of escalation protocol. Within 30 minutes, the valley was swarming with personnel. Elena counted at least 20 people, including what appeared to be technical specialists, security personnel, and someone who looked like a senior government official based on how deferentially the others treated him. Elena realized that she was witnessing something extraordinary, the discovery and recovery of evidence that government agencies had been searching for since 1944. Morrison's hidden aircraft represented one of the most significant historical secrets of the 20th century.
But Elena also recognized that her presence at the discovery site made her an enormous liability to the government personnel conducting the recovery. She had documented Morrison's evidence, photographed classified materials, and could potentially testify about crimes that powerful institutions preferred to keep buried. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Elena watched the recovery team systematically dismantle Morrison's concealment and prepare the aircraft for removal. They worked with obvious familiarity with classified materials and historical evidence, suggesting this wasn't their first operation of this type. Most ominously, Elena observed the team leader briefing what appeared to be security personnel while pointing in various directions around the valley. Their body language suggested they were organizing a search for additional personnel, specifically searching for Elena herself. Elena realized that her situation had become desperate. She was trapped in Morrison's Valley with government agents who had strong incentives to prevent her from ever revealing what she had discovered. Her family was under surveillance and pressure, and the evidence that could have transformed their circumstances was now in the hands of the same institutions that had suppressed it for 8 decades. But Elena also recognized that she still possessed something valuable: the documentary evidence she had already collected, including photographs and copies of Morrison's most damaging materials. If she could somehow escape from the valley and reach safety, she might still be able to expose the truth about wartime human experiments. As darkness began falling over the Colorado wilderness, Elena prepared for what would either be her escape to safety or her final confrontation with forces that had been suppressing Morrison's evidence since 1944. The ghost plane had finally been discovered, but the battle over its secrets was just beginning. Elena thought about Sofia, safe but hidden with Mrs. Chen, and about the promise she had made to her daughter that they would be together again soon. Whatever happened in the coming hours, Elena was determined to ensure that Morrison's evidence would finally be revealed and that the victims of government crimes would receive the justice they had been denied for 8 decades. The story that had begun with a reluctant inheritance was about to reach its climax in the darkness of Morrison's Valley, where Elena would either find a way to honor her grandmother's legacy or become another casualty in the government's long campaign to suppress inconvenient truths. Elena knew she had perhaps 30 minutes before the government search teams would expand their perimeter and make escape impossible. As full darkness settled over Morrison's Valley, she began moving carefully through the forest, using Carmen's detailed knowledge of the terrain to navigate routes that would keep her hidden from the recovery operation below. The documents and photographs she had secured in her waterproof pack represented the only remaining evidence of Morrison's discoveries that wasn't now in government hands. Elena understood that these materials were simultaneously her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. They could either secure her family's future or make her a permanent target for elimination.
Moving through the wilderness in darkness required every skill Elena had learned during childhood camping trips with her father. She navigated by starlight and memory, following game trails and natural features that would leave minimal tracks for anyone attempting to follow her. The recovery team's floodlights illuminated the valley below, but Elena was already climbing toward the ridge that would take her back to Carmen's cabin. The satellite phone in her pack remained silent. Elena couldn't risk communication that might be intercepted, and she needed to focus completely on reaching safety before the search teams realized she had been present during their operation. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, every broken branch potentially alerting pursuit teams to her location. After 2 hours of careful movement through increasingly difficult terrain, Elena finally reached the ridge overlooking Carmen's cabin. Using binoculars, she surveyed the area for any signs of surveillance or unauthorized personnel. The cabin appeared dark and undisturbed, but Elena knew that appearances could be deceiving when dealing with sophisticated government operations. She approached the cabin using a circuitous route that would allow her to observe the building from multiple angles before committing to entry. Carmen's security precautions, which had seemed excessive when Elena first arrived, now appeared prescient and necessary. Her grandmother had understood that protecting Morrison's evidence would require constant vigilance against discovery. The cabin was indeed empty, but Elena found signs that it had been searched during her absence. Drawers had been opened and carefully closed, papers had been examined and replaced, and Carmen's computer showed evidence of attempted access. The searchers had been professional and thorough, but they had apparently found nothing of immediate value. Elena realized that the government teams had been monitoring her activities since her arrival at the property, probably through electronic surveillance that had detected her presence and movements. Her discovery of Morrison's aircraft wasn't accidental from their perspective. They had been watching and waiting for her to lead them to the evidence they had been seeking for 8 decades. Working quickly, Elena gathered the backup documentation she had hidden around the cabin and prepared for immediate departure. Staying at the property was no longer safe, and she needed to reach civilization where she could contact allies and develop a strategy for protecting both her family and Morrison's evidence. But as Elena loaded her vehicle and prepared to leave, she heard the sound of approaching helicopters. Looking skyward, she could see aircraft with searchlights moving across the mountainous terrain, clearly conducting an organized hunt for someone attempting to escape the area. Elena realized that the government operation was far more extensive than she had initially understood. They weren't just recovering Morrison's aircraft, they were conducting a comprehensive effort to locate and suppress anyone who might have knowledge of the evidence it contained. The dirt road leading away from Carmen's property would make Elena visible to aerial surveillance, but remaining at the cabin would mean certain capture. Elena made the desperate decision to attempt escape on foot through the wilderness, carrying only essential supplies and Morrison's most critical documents. As helicopter searchlights swept across the forest around the cabin, Elena disappeared into the darkness of the Colorado mountains, beginning what would either be her escape to safety or her final flight from forces that had been suppressing inconvenient truths since 1944. Elena spent 3 days moving through the wilderness, following remote trails and staying hidden during daylight hours when aircraft surveillance was most active. She rationed her limited food and water carefully, knowing that reaching civilization would require crossing exposed terrain where she would be vulnerable to detection. On the 4th morning, exhausted and nearly out of supplies, Elena encountered an unexpected ally. Dr. James Kellerman was camping alone near a remote mountain lake, apparently conducting botanical research for the University of Colorado. He appeared to be in his 70s, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. "You look like someone who's been having a rough time in the mountains," Dr. Kellerman observed when Elena emerged from the forest near his campsite. "Are you injured? Do you need help?" Elena's first instinct was suspicion. After days of evading pursuit, she was wary of any unexpected encounters. But Dr. Kellerman's genuine concern and academic credentials seemed authentic, and Elena desperately needed assistance from someone outside the government operation pursuing her. "I'm a bit lost," Elena admitted cautiously. "I've been hiking for several days and my supplies are running low." Dr. Kellerman invited Elena to share his campfire and offered food and water while they talked. As conversation developed, Elena learned that Dr. Kellerman was retired from university research but continued studying high-altitude plant ecology in the Colorado mountains. More significantly, his surname was familiar from Morrison's documents. "Dr. Kellerman," Elena said carefully, "are you by any chance related to Dr. Sarah Kellerman?" The elderly scientist looked startled. "Sarah was my aunt. She died many years ago, but she was a physician who worked on some kind of classified research during World War II. How do you know that name?" Elena realized that she had encountered the nephew of one of Morrison's key witnesses, someone whose family had been affected by the same historical crimes she was trying to expose. After careful consideration, Elena decided to trust Dr. Kellerman with at least part of her story. "I've been researching wartime medical experiments," Elena explained. "Your aunt's name appears in historical documents related to radiation research conducted during the Manhattan Project." Dr. Kellerman's expression grew grave. "My aunt never spoke about her wartime work, but she suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. She had nightmares about patients she couldn't help, and medical procedures she was forced to participate in against her conscience." Elena showed Dr. Kellerman some of Morrison's less sensitive documents, including the interview transcript with his aunt. As he read his relative's words describing her forced participation in human radiation experiments, Dr. Kellerman's face reflected a mixture of sadness and anger. "My God," he whispered. "She tried to tell us, but we thought she was suffering from war trauma. We never understood that she was trying to confess to crimes she had been forced to commit against her conscience." Dr. Kellerman revealed that his aunt had left behind personal papers describing her guilt about wartime activities, but the family had never understood the specific context. Sarah Kellerman had apparently carried the burden of her forced participation in human experiments for her entire life, dying without ever receiving acknowledgement or forgiveness for actions she had been compelled to take. "Dr. Kellerman," Elena said, "I have evidence that could finally vindicate your aunt and provide justice for the victims of those experiments. But I'm being pursued by government agents who want to suppress this information permanently." Elena explained her situation more completely, describing the discovery of Morrison's aircraft and the evidence it contained. Dr. Kellerman listened with growing amazement and determination, recognizing that Elena's materials could finally provide the historical truth his family had been seeking for decades. "My aunt made me promise to preserve her wartime papers. She insisted that someday the truth would emerge and her testimony would be needed. I've kept those documents for 30 years, never understanding their significance until now."
Dr. Kellerman revealed that he had been camping in this remote area not just for botanical research, but because he had received strange inquiries from government agencies about his aunt's wartime service. Someone had been asking about family papers and whether any classified materials had been preserved after Sarah Kellerman's death. "They've been watching our family too," Dr. Kellerman realized. "Whoever is suppressing this information has been monitoring anyone with connections to the original witnesses." Elena and Dr. Kellerman spent the rest of the day developing a strategy for escaping government surveillance and bringing Morrison's evidence to public attention. Dr. Kellerman's contacts in academic and media circles who might be able to authenticate and publicize the materials, but reaching those contacts would require evading continued pursuit. Dr. Kellerman's vehicle was parked at a trailhead several miles away, offering Elena her first opportunity to escape the wilderness and return to civilization. But both of them understood that emergence from the mountains would trigger a new phase of their confrontation with forces that had been suppressing Morrison's evidence for 8 decades. Dr. Kellerman's Jeep navigated the mountain roads with practiced efficiency, taking routes that would avoid main highways where government surveillance might be watching for Elena's emergence from the wilderness. They drove through the night, reaching Grand Junction as the sun rose over the red rock formations surrounding the city. Elena's first priority was contacting Mrs. Chen to ensure Sofia's safety. Using Dr. Kellerman's secure university phone line, she reached Mrs. Chen at their latest hiding location, a cabin owned by Mrs. Chen's nephew near Rocky Mountain National Park. "Elena, thank God," Mrs. Chen said when she heard Elena's voice. "Sofia has been so worried about you. Are you safe?" "I'm safe now, and I'll be coming to get Sofia soon, but I need you to stay hidden for a few more days while I resolve some legal matters." Elena spoke briefly with Sofia, whose resilient spirit had helped her adapt to their extended adventure. "Mama, Mrs. Chen says we're like characters in a spy movie. Are we really hiding from bad guys?" "Just for a little while longer, sweetheart, but soon we'll be together and everything will be better." After securing communication with her daughter, Elena and Dr. Kellerman began implementing their plan to bring Morrison's evidence to public attention. Dr. Kellerman's academic contacts included investigative journalists, historians specializing in government accountability, and legal experts experienced in handling classified materials. Their first contact was Dr. Patricia Martinez, a historian at Stanford University who had written extensively about Manhattan Project ethics and human radiation experiments. Dr. Martinez agreed to meet them immediately when Dr. Kellerman described the nature of Elena's evidence. The meeting took place at a secure location, Dr. Martinez's private office, where they could examine Morrison's documents without risk of electronic surveillance. Dr. Martinez's reaction to the materials was immediate and dramatic. "This is extraordinary," she said, studying Morrison's photographs and medical records. "These documents provide direct evidence of systematic human experiments that we've suspected for decades but never been able to prove definitively." Dr. Martinez explained that historians had long known that the Manhattan Project conducted unethical human experiments, but the full scope and systematic nature of these crimes had remained hidden. Morrison's evidence documented not just isolated incidents, but a coordinated program of human testing that violated every principle of medical ethics. The government acknowledged some human radiation experiments in the 1990s, but their admissions were limited and incomplete. Morrison's materials show that the actual scope was far greater than anything officially acknowledged. More importantly, Dr. Martinez confirmed that Morrison's evidence would have enormous value to victims' families and legal advocates seeking compensation and acknowledgement. Several class action lawsuits related to government human experiments had been hampered by lack of comprehensive documentation. Morrison's materials could provide the evidence needed to reopen those cases. Dr. Martinez also verified Elena's assessment of the material's financial value. Historical documents of this significance and controversy could be indeed worth millions to collectors, museums, and media organizations. But she cautioned Elena about the risks of attempting to profit from evidence of government crimes. The same agencies that suppressed this information in 1944 still exist today. They have resources and authority that individual citizens can't match. You need legal protection before going public with these materials. Dr. Martinez recommended contacting Susan Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney with experience handling cases involving government accountability and historical injustices. Rodriguez had successfully represented families of radiation experiment victims and would understand both the legal value and potential dangers of Morrison's evidence. That afternoon, Elena found herself in Rodriguez's office in Denver, surrounded by legal experts who were examining Morrison's documents with growing excitement and concern. Rodriguez confirmed that the materials provided unprecedented evidence of government crimes, but she also emphasized the personal risks Elena faced. The agencies involved in covering up these experiments have virtually unlimited resources. They can make your life extremely difficult through legal harassment, financial pressure, and surveillance. You need to understand what you're getting into before deciding to pursue this.
But Rodriguez also outlined the potential benefits of exposing Morrison's evidence. Beyond the obvious financial value, Elena could help provide justice for thousands of victims who had never received acknowledgement or compensation. The evidence could force congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, and systemic reforms that would prevent future abuses. More importantly, Rodriguez said, you could finally honor the sacrifice of Captain Morrison and your grandmother Carmen. They preserved this evidence for 8 decades, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it to light. Elena thought about Sofia, still in hiding because of government agents who preferred to suppress historical truth rather than acknowledge past crimes. She thought about Carmen, who had spent 8 decades in isolation to protect Morrison's evidence, and she thought about the victims documented in Morrison's files, people who had died without ever knowing what had been done to them. What do I need to do to bring this evidence public safely? Elena asked. Rodriguez outlined a comprehensive strategy involving simultaneous release of information to multiple media outlets, academic institutions, and government oversight agencies. By making the evidence available to numerous independent parties at once, Elena could make it impossible for any single agency to suppress the information effectively. We'll also file legal motions to protect you and your daughter from retaliation, Rodriguez added. Once this information is public, harming you would only draw more attention to the evidence you've revealed. Elena realized that she had reached the final decision point in her extraordinary journey. She could still walk away, selling Carmen's property quietly and using the proceeds to rebuild her normal life. Or she could honor Morrison's sacrifice and Carmen's legacy by ensuring that the truth about government crimes would finally emerge. Elena's decision to go public triggered a carefully orchestrated media campaign that began on a Monday morning in September. Rodriguez had coordinated simultaneous release of Morrison's evidence to the Washington Post, the New York Times, 60 Minutes, and 3 academic institutions specializing in government accountability research. The initial stories were explosive. World War II pilot's hidden evidence exposes systematic human experiments, read the Washington Post headline, accompanied by photographs of Morrison's documents and the recovered P-38 Lightning. The Times focused on the personal stories of experiment victims, using Morrison's medical records to document individual cases of government abuse. The evidence could force congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, and systemic reforms that would prevent future abuses. Elena found herself at the center of a media hurricane that had been building since Morrison's death in 1944. Television interviews, newspaper profiles, and academic conferences all sought her perspective on the discovery that was reshaping American understanding of Manhattan Project ethics. I never intended to become a historical whistleblower, Elena told Katie Couric during a nationally televised interview. I was just a single mother trying to solve my family's financial problems. But once I understood what Captain Morrison had died trying to expose, I couldn't just walk away. The government's response was swift and predictable. Official statements minimized the significance of Morrison's evidence, claiming that the documented experiments had already been acknowledged and that current policies prevented similar abuses. But the comprehensive nature of Morrison's documentation made such dismissals impossible to sustain. Congressional hearings began within weeks, with Elena testifying about her discovery and preservation of the evidence. The hearings revealed that government agencies had indeed been searching for Morrison's materials for decades, confirming Elena's suspicions about ongoing suppression efforts. The systematic nature of these experiments and the decades-long cover-up represent one of the most serious violations of human rights in American history, declared Congressman Michael Torres, no relation to Elena, during the House oversight hearings. The legal implications of Morrison's evidence proved as significant as Elena had hoped. Rodriguez successfully filed class action lawsuits on behalf of experiment victims' families, using Morrison's documentation to prove government liability for decades of unreported crimes. The initial settlement offers exceeded $200 million, with additional compensation pending completion of victim identification processes. Elena's personal transformation paralleled the broader historical revelations. Media attention and legal settlements had indeed solved her family's financial problems, but more importantly, they had connected her to a community of advocates, historians, and activists working to prevent government abuses. The University of Colorado offered Elena a position as a research coordinator for their new Center for Government Accountability, recognizing her unique experience with historical evidence preservation and public disclosure. "Mama, are we rich now?" Sofia asked during one of their first conversations after Elena's return from the mountains. "We're secure now, sweetheart. But more importantly, we helped some people get justice for terrible things that happened to their families long ago." Sofia, now 11 and increasingly interested in her mother's work, had begun asking sophisticated questions about government accountability and historical justice. The experience of hiding from federal agents and watching her mother confront powerful institutions had matured her understanding of how adult conflicts could affect families.
Carmen's property became the site of the Morrison Vasquez Memorial for Government Accountability, preserving both the recovered P-38 Lightning and comprehensive documentation of the human experiments it had revealed. Elena served on the memorial's board of directors, ensuring that visitors would understand not just the historical crimes, but the decades-long effort required to bring them to light. Dr. Kellerman donated his aunt's papers to the memorial, finally providing Sarah Kellerman with the posthumous vindication she had sought throughout her life. Her documentation of forced participation in human experiments became part of the comprehensive record that Morrison's evidence had made possible. 2 years after Elena's discovery of Morrison's aircraft, she stood before the completed memorial in what had once been Morrison's Valley. The hidden P-38 Lightning was now displayed in a climate-controlled pavilion surrounded by exhibits documenting both the human experiments it had revealed and the 80-year effort to suppress that evidence. Visitors to the memorial included families of experiment victims, historians researching government accountability, and students learning about the importance of protecting whistleblowers and preserving historical evidence. Elena often served as a guide, sharing her perspective on how ordinary citizens could confront institutional power when armed with truth and determination. "The remarkable thing about Captain Morrison," Elena would tell visitors, "is that he understood his responsibility to future generations. He could have ignored what he witnessed and focused on his own survival. Instead, he chose to preserve evidence that would eventually provide justice for people he would never meet." Elena's custody battle with Marcus had been resolved definitively in her favor. The legal settlements and media attention had demonstrated her ability to provide Sofia with security and opportunities that Marcus's family couldn't match. More importantly, Elena's advocacy work had shown Sofia the importance of standing up for justice, even when doing so involved personal risk. Marcus himself had largely disappeared from their lives, apparently uncomfortable with the public attention that Elena's historical discoveries had generated. His family's concerns about Sofia's living conditions seemed absurd in light of Elena's transformation from struggling single mother to nationally recognized advocate for government accountability. Sofia thrived in their new circumstances, but Elena was careful to ensure that financial security didn't insulate her daughter from understanding the struggles that ordinary families faced. They volunteered at local food banks, supported educational programs for underprivileged children, and maintained connections with the community that had sustained them during their most difficult times. "I want Sofia to understand that having resources creates responsibilities," Elena explained to reporters who asked about her daughter's upbringing. "We received help when we needed it most, and now we need to help others facing similar challenges." The memorial had also become a research center where historians, legal advocates, and policy experts worked to prevent future government abuses.
Elena's experience with preserving and revealing classified evidence had made her a sought-after consultant for other families dealing with historical injustices and cover-ups. Dr. Martinez had received a major grant to establish the Morrison Research Project, systematically investigating other potential cases of suppressed evidence related to government human experiments. Elena served as the project's community liaison, helping connect academic researchers with families who might possess relevant historical materials. Elena's discovery demonstrates that historical truth has a way of emerging, Dr. Martinez observed during a conference presentation. Government agencies can suppress evidence for decades, but they can't eliminate it entirely. Eventually, someone like Elena will find it and have the courage to bring it to light. The financial settlements from the class action lawsuits had exceeded everyone's expectations. Morrison's evidence had enabled successful claims by hundreds of experiment victims' families, with total compensation approaching $500 million. Elena's role in preserving and revealing the evidence had earned her a significant finder's fee, but she had donated most of those funds to support additional research and victim compensation. Elena's personal financial security came primarily from her university position and consulting work, supplemented by speaking fees and book royalties from the memoirs she had written about her extraordinary experience. The book, titled The Ghost Plane, A Mother's Discovery of America's Hidden History, had become a bestseller and was being adapted for a major motion picture. But Elena's most meaningful reward came from letters she received from families of experiment victims who had finally received acknowledgement and compensation for their relatives' suffering. Reading their expressions of gratitude and relief reminded Elena why Morrison and Carmen had been willing to sacrifice so much to preserve the evidence of government crimes.
My father died 20 years ago, without ever knowing why he suffered from radiation sickness after his release from prison, the letter read. Thanks to your courage in revealing Captain Morrison's evidence, we finally understand what was done to him. More importantly, the settlement funds have allowed us to establish a scholarship program in his memory. His suffering now helps other families pursue education and opportunities he was denied. Elena shared the letter with Sofia, who was now 13 and increasingly interested in historical research and civil rights advocacy. Together, they visited Morrison's grave at Arlington National Cemetery, where a new headstone finally acknowledged his role in exposing government crimes and protecting American citizens from institutional abuse. "Will you tell me the whole story again, Mama?" Sofia asked as they stood beside Morrison's grave. "From the beginning, when you first got Grandma Carmen's letter." Elena smiled, recognizing that Sofia would probably grow up to continue the family tradition of confronting injustice and preserving historical truth. It started with a desperate single mother who inherited more than she expected, Elena began. And it ended with justice for people who had waited 80 years to have their voices heard. As they walked among the white headstones of Arlington Cemetery, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a struggling aircraft mechanic to a guardian of historical truth. Morrison's ghost plane had indeed contained a fortune, not just in monetary terms, but in the form of justice, accountability, and the knowledge that ordinary citizens could still challenge powerful institutions when armed with truth and determination. The legacy Elena was building for Sofia included financial security, but more importantly, it included the understanding that preserving truth and protecting the vulnerable represented the highest form of public service. Some discoveries changed individual lives, but Morrison's evidence had changed history itself, proving that secrets buried in mountain forests could eventually illuminate the darkest corners of government power. Elena's story had begun with reluctant inheritance and desperate circumstances.
It ended with the satisfaction of knowing that Captain Morrison's sacrifice had finally achieved its intended purpose, and that Elena and Sofia's family would forever be connected to one of the most important historical revelations of the 21st century. The ghost plane had given up its secrets at last, and the truth would never again be buried in the Colorado wilderness.